Thank you for joining us for Talking Sleep, a podcast of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Seema Khosla, Medical Director of the North Dakota Center for Sleep in Fargo. After nearly 3 years, the Department of Justice and the Food and Drug Administration have finally agreed to the terms of a consent decree with Philips. This states that Philips Respironics cannot manufacture or distribute new sleep and respiratory care devices in the U.S. market until certain criteria are met, unless the device is classified by the FDA as being medically necessary. The scope of the recall is far larger than just consumer PAP devices. This impacts sleep diagnostics, including Alice PSG systems, home sleep apnea test platforms, and in-lab titration devices. Furthermore, the OmniLab device was recalled but has not yet been remediated. Here to help us understand the impact of the consent decree are Dr. Aneesa Das, Dr. Peter Gay, and Dr. Robert Owens. Dr. Das is a professor in the Division of Pulmonary, Critical Care, and Sleep at The Ohio State University. Dr. Gay is a professor of medicine at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and Dr. Owens is a professor of medicine at UC San Diego. For full disclosure, Philips was invited to participate in this discussion, but declined, saying that they'd rather wait until they can provide helpful assets and further guidance. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Seema.
So let's start with some of the basics. So Dr. Gay, I know you're not a lawyer, but can you help us understand what exactly is a consent decree?
Well, I can tell you from a printed document that Philips has provided that it's an agreement negotiated between the U.S. government and a company, in this case Respironics, and the U.S. government component is actually the Department of Justice that makes these decisions. So it avoids, as otherwise they would have to do, litigating all this stuff in the courts. So this is now a discussion between the FDA and Respironics that's governed by the Department of Justice, and they decide what's going to happen with this quality-related matter of all of their equipment so that the Respironics manufacturing facilities in the U.S. can do this again. So the perspective here was that they are now focused on a quality issue for the betterment of U.S. citizens using Respironics devices, and their conclusion, as you're saying here, was that they can no longer produce equipment in the United States until the Department of Justice people sitting in their factories, as it were, saying that they're going to meet this compliance. Well, now their conclusion was, look, let's just stop. We'll do whatever else they tell us to do, but all they've done is basically given us milestones of the safety levels we have to do. And this is going to take years for us to comply. We are just going to stop producing devices, figure this out, and make whatever certain things we feel is, from a business standpoint, appropriate, and move all of our business otherwise to Europe. So that's the nuts and bolts that I get out of this.
Philips has this gigantic share of the market, right? Right from sort of diagnostics to treatment. So maybe let's break it down and start with sleep diagnostics. So what's going to happen with PSG systems like Alice?
Well, as you know, they function well, and it is my understanding that it's the majority of laboratories in the United States that use the Alice. So they have the market share, as you're saying. And if they're functioning right now, they can get whatever replacement equipment, and they are bound by the agreement to provide assistance with this. But you got to sort of wonder, if they're not making any money, they're paying $1 billion settlement, just how much support you're going to get. So I think a lot of people are saying, hey, listen, we have to get ready now to move our laboratory into equipment that we can get on a long-term basis, replacement, familiarity to it, because Alice Night 1 is now a no longer product.
But they're still going to service it, right?
Yes.
Aneesa, do you know how long they're going to service it until?
Yeah, actually, they have they've announced 19 discontinued products. The Alice 6 and the Alice Night 1 and the Alice PDX are all listed in those 19, but they have offered to provide service through 2029 for the Night 1 and the 6, January 2029, and October of 2028 for the PDX.
And then what about the home sleep apnea device?
I don't know anybody that's using the Philips home sleep apnea device anymore.
Oh, we are.
Are you?
Yeah, we have some, yeah. And the thing that we're struggling with is the replaceables, like the blue belts. And so, I get that they're going to support the software, but what about the disposables?
So that's interesting because in the Philips press release, they specifically said that they will continue to provide accessories, including masks and consumables, including patient circuits and replacement parts. So according to their own comment, they should be continuing to make those.
And from a business standpoint, it probably is worthwhile.
I mean, one would imagine, right? Because that's, recurring revenue, but it's
Right.
been a challenge. So I feel like there's a lot of talk of we're going to do the masks and a lot of the patient facing stuff, right? But even from the diagnostic component, we have had a hard time getting blue belts and, cannulas and stuff like that.
Well, the question is, do they feel as a company that they're a target now? That the business would be better served continuing to develop product in Europe and doing whatever's acceptable from the marketing and legal standpoint in the US, and the market will decide.
Mm. Well, and so then you have to wonder, right? We've seen this plethora of all of these new devices, right? There's one with mandibular movement, and then there's one, with a sleep quality index. And so there's all these new devices that are popping up. So do you think that this is going to make us use these other devices faster?
I think most definitely the response to this was, you fools in sleep medicine, you put all your eggs in one basket and you deserve what you got. When one company went down, you're in this mess. But I think that's much too simple to put it that way, because I think we learned from the COVID war, as I perceive it, that we learned we're adaptable, that we're crisis management people, and crisis is here to stay, and we're developing management protocols in sleep. We're getting the recognition, I think, on a national level that this is important, and we are becoming more nimble at adapting to this. We went through the Serve HF business where we were getting 200 phone calls a day,
Right.
and we had to have a protocol with how to deal with people who were bus drivers and flying airplanes and all kinds of things. Well, they were flying airplanes, but that's the point. That we are now recognizing that we can adapt, and we're thinking up front, where do we not want to find ourselves in a situation where we have to go to war again? But I think it was a good learning experience in that regard. Not that I want to go through it again, but it was a learning experience for us to say, how are we going to now change our protocols? Maybe an oral appliance should be a first line therapy, like you're saying. I think that's a great idea.
So I actually do think there has been a shift. I don't know if it's been directly because of the recall or more of a byproduct of the recall. And then on top of that, there were shipping delays and we had a hard time getting the ability to do wireless transfer. And so we had a shortage of alternatives. And I know, at least in our area, that was associated with a significant shift in the way we treat patients with mild sleep apnea. I think we became a little bit more conservative. Do you really have symptoms, right? Is it really warranted? And then you're right, oral appliances. I think the dentists got a lot busier. And it probably pushed growth and development of different mandibular advancement devices.
So I was kind of getting at like the mandibular movement signal from one of the new HSAT devices. But your point about alternate treatment modalities is very well taken. Because we've got all these new devices, right, that are like, oh, hey, use our device to diagnose obstructive sleep apnea, and you just have to learn this metric. Oh, but this metric is better.
Well, the old paradigm was that CPAP works tonight, works tomorrow night, but you got to wear it every night. And this is the one that will resolve your sleep disordered breathing and snoring, is no longer viable for the informed patient who comes into your office and says, okay, that's fine. What else have you got, doc? And I saw this Roku device on TV where I just press it and then I don't have to do anything more with these tortured patients on CPAP masks in the next frame of the commercial. Patients are expecting us to be more nimble with coming up with different ways to treat them.
I've never heard it described as Roku. I love that. Bob, what are you seeing in your neck of the woods?
Well, I was going to say that I think that these changes have definitely been accelerated by all of the Philips turmoil. From the recall, now with the leaving of the market and the consent decree, and COVID. So it's kind of amazing that there are these silver linings here. Peter, I think for years we've said, when in doubt, pressurize the snout, try CPAP, that's your best option. And then because that wasn't as much of an option, it really has opened the door to other diagnostic tools and treatment paradigms. So, what we're seeing is, I think there already was the shift to more home sleep apnea testing. It was just for us faster. I mean, our volumes are huge. I mean, everyone on this call knows how many people have sleep apnea, and we just did not have the capacity using traditional methods. And so we are definitely going more towards home-based diagnostic solutions. And this is just another thing that has kind of put less emphasis on PSG and lab.
Bob, what we've done here, we've kind of let the cat out of the bag here, and I'm not sure it's the greatest idea, but somebody said we have to try it. We're letting a portion of the family medicine practitioners in the local area here in Rochester actually order directly through our lab a home sleep test that they are expected for straightforward sleep apnea to not only get the device in the appropriate patient, but manage it from there with an empiric PAP protocol. So, I mean, to answer your problem of not meeting the demand, we're trying to do this. But the problem with that is they clearly find the ease of ordering one thing, and then the understanding of managing sleep patients is 90% of the whole process. And it's going to blow up is what I kind of feel.
We're doing the same thing here, and our PCPs are ordering HSATs. And you know what's really interesting? I think if you have an HSAT that's positive, that's pretty easy, and then we'll get them in eventually and do some education. It's when they say, home sleep test is negative, you don't have sleep apnea.
Right.
It's really the negative tests that are harder to interpret, and somehow we haven't quite gotten that message out yet to them, and so that's a real problem, that people have sleep apnea, they get seen, they get a home test that's non-diagnostic, and then they stop. So anyway, it's going to open up a whole lot of growth in different pathways, but you got to make sure that the patient remains at the center of that and you get them treated.
Well, and I feel like, so it's funny to hear you guys talk about this. In my neck of the woods, this has been our model for 15 years, where we really try to empower the primary care doc because they have an established relationship with the patient. We try to support them. So when we first started, they can order direct to the lab, they can order HSAT direct. And I will put my phone number down on every interpretation, and they'll call and we'll co-manage patients or we'll troubleshoot. And you're right, that education of a negative HSAT does not rule out sleep apnea is such an important message. But, just because we're in such a rural area, we've had to do that so that we can deliver sleep care into our communities.
We do 100 oximetries a day at Mayo where the general internist doesn't care what the result is. All they want to know is if they need a sleep consult. And when they call up, I say, well, did you talk to the patient? Do they snore? Do they have hypertension? And the idea that these tests tell the answer rather than the patient tells you the answer is the message we're not quite getting across. And I think when that comes through, they'll do as Bob is saying, hey, wait a minute. They came to me with a problem. They didn't come to me with just, do I have a positive portable sleep study or not?
So let's talk about the in-lab devices, the titration devices. The OmniLab Advanced Plus system was included in the recall, but these devices haven't been remediated. So where do we go from here?
Yeah, Dr. Kusla, I think this is the crux of the issue, in all honesty, because we at least have some competition for the home sleep apnea devices. We have some competition and some other opportunities for different PAP manufacturers. There's really only, historically, there's been only two players in the game for the titration devices, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now that OmniLab is recalled, people are handling it differently. So some labs that were all OmniLab are continuing to use those titration devices, and they're having patient side waivers because otherwise they couldn't titrate them.
Right.
Alternatively, our lab was half and half, fortunately. So we did not have all of our eggs in one basket, as it were. So at the current time, we have the OmniLabs, but we're not using them because they are recalled. Mm-hmm. And so we're only running half of our, despite having a pretty robust and large lab, and we can do polysomnograms in all of them, but we can only do titration studies in half of them. So that means that patients who need titrations have a harder time getting in. Does it make sense?
Mm-hmm. Well, and you taught me something that in your area, Medicaid patients must have a titration study before they can get CPAP.
Yep, absolutely. And that, so in our area, not only do they not cover home sleep apnea tests for Medicaid patients, but after they have a positive study, they won't cover PAP until they've had a titration. So these patients have to have a titration study as well. So if you have a lab, let's say and lots of labs are scheduling way out because of this. So let's say you're scheduling out 3 months, which is not unheard of in our area, and you get a diagnostic study that wasn't able to be split. Now that patient has to wait an additional 3 months if they're not able to be expedited to get their titration. And my concern is where we already have issues where we're trying to address healthcare disparity, we're just further increasing this disparity because patients who are on government insurance, or Medicaid rather specifically, now have a longer wait time to get PAP.
Bob, do you see the same thing in California?
We used to, so starting in January 1st, 2023, our Medicaid or Medi-Cal allowed us to do home sleep apnea testing. And that has made a huge difference. We were the only lab in San Diego County that would do Medi-Cal in-lab studies, and we sort of had to drip those people in to our, frankly, limited and scarce beds, and it was tough. So we've been able to do home sleep apnea testing, but I think you're right that the CPAP titration is a scarce resource, and so you have to think, does titration make sense? You could look at the CMS criteria. If someone doesn't meet adherence, you got them a new mask, and they're going to meet the adherence in the next 90 days. Do we really need a CMS? Do we really need a titration study for that patient? Like, can't I just write a note and said, found the right mask, we're good to go?
I would love to see that note.
Well, I mean, we all would. But my point is, I think we do a lot of titrations because it's the rules. I don't think it's good medicine, and it makes people jump through hoops. And so maybe as a field, we need to, and Peter and I and others have tried to do this, where we say, does this make sense? And I think the argument's even stronger now, where the capacity to do titrations is going to be more limited.
So Bob and I are now firm advocates, and we've been policy wonks together now for several years. The mantra that we go forth with is the right device for the right patient at the right time. And in the process of reviewing the more sophisticated devices, which Medicare has gone on their own to call respiratory assist devices, they're directed in a way that is now more and more divergent from practice. And the bigger problem is taking the lead from government and provider regulations. Fundamentally, physicians are subject to coverage determination guiding practice, and it needs to be the reverse. And as we try and present more data, for example, with COPD, it's very clear that more aggressive titration actually improves mortality to a profound extent. And now we can't get these devices unless we order ventilators. So we bring this to Medicare, the durable medical equipment carriers who create the local regulations, and that's why the disparities you see. We are not subject to the in laboratory testing for Medicare patients as well, like Bob. So these regional differences in regulatory requirements that dictate practice, they're just wrong. That fundamentally physicians should be doing this.
And so when we were chatting in preparation for this, you had brought up this regional variation in terms of payer policy, but I feel like you also challenged us a little bit that we need legislative change to really improve access for underserved patients. So how do we do that?
Well, again, as Bob and I have learned, you just keep banging your head against the wall until you like it. It is languid. It is dinosaur paced in what's going on. And just think of what you're actually asking. The difference between a regulatory approach, which we're taking now through the Medicare base, versus legislative, which by definition means Congress. And then you realize what you say immediately means this is a bill that goes to Congress. What's happening right now with absolutely crucial things in the world that takes months and years to decide? Where are we going to get the attention for that kind of thing to happen? That's 3 to 5 years in the making. So you really want to work on the regulatory basis of the current acceptable practice in the area. And in my mind, you're going to move on the regulatory level, the regulatory direction, much faster than you'll ever do anything legislative. That's the facts.
One common theme that comes up a lot is that a lot of the time we don't know what the ASM has been doing. So I will put in a plug here for some advocacy work that the ASM has done, that they have reached out to Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, who's been, as you know, very vocal about this. And so they have asked him to, urge the FDA to really specifically look at OmniLabs and trilogies. And so, kudos to the advocacy folks for reaching out and establishing that.
But the FDA could basically say this is a good device, this should be approved, this should be recognized. But the coverage, the payment system is what directs how you can deliver something to a patient.
And I would just add, if you actually try to find the information of what test is approved in what part of the United States, that's hard.
It is hard.
The ASM does not have a list of what gets approved in Washington State versus California or whatever. So it's been eye-opening working with Peter to see how slowly some of these processes happen. It's been great working with American Thoracic Society Chest, AASM, to at least start to send letters to say, hey, we would like to change this policy. I don't know if that's actually going to change anything, but it's great to see the interest from all our societies in making some of these changes and starting to find out what are these pathways, because it's not like the Mr. Smith goes to Washington and how a bill becomes a law. It's complicated, and most people don't know how this stuff gets done.
No, you're exactly right. So let's take a short break, and when we come back, we'll talk more about the Philips consent decree and what this means for sleep clinicians. You're listening to Talking Sleep from the American Academy of Sleep Medicine.
While attending Sleep 2024, the annual conference for sleep medicine professionals, add these fun activities to your schedule. Join the pack for food and drinks with your peers on Saturday, June 1st at its Lone Star Fiesta. Workout enthusiasts, kick off your morning with yoga, Zumba, and breakfast at Vibe Fusion Fitness on June 2nd. Sunday evening, socialize with food and drinks at Club Hypnos. Register at sleepmeeting.org or on-site when you arrive.
Welcome back to Talking Sleep. We're talking with Dr. Das, Dr. Owens, and Dr. Gay about the Philips consent decree. So, Aneesa, you kind of hit on something a little bit earlier where you talked about using a consent with the OmniLabs. Is that what you're doing?
So we are not at our center. We're actually not using our omnilab devices right now until they can be remediated, which, as we all know, they're not being offered to be remediated at the moment. So we're just using those that have the ResMed titration protocols. But that's another issue, is that there's many labs who are trying to get ResMed titration equipment and are unable to. So the reason I mentioned that this is the biggest issue is there's only one other player that I'm aware of right now for titration equipment. And there's been difficulty in getting those. So as centers want to expand, as we do, it's hard to get those additional beds in. I mean, titration equipment in.
Right. You're right. It is hard. We've been trying. We keep getting told next quarter, next quarter, next quarter.
Yeah. There are many centers, and I've talked to colleagues around the country who are still using their OmniLab. As you know, it's a one night exposure, so there's potentially mitigated risk there. And they're just having patients sign in an acknowledgement and consent. So I do know that that's happening in other centers in the country.
Well, there is this $1 billion settlement out there that has been awarded for injury that has been incurred through this behavior. But ultimately, there's parallel data that they're looking at. I mean, the true link of the carcinogenic effect of volatile organic compounds is there, but you have more VOCs under your sink than probably are linked to this Phillips thing. So the true danger to patients is unknown. Now, that said, you can't hide under a rock and say this stuff floating out of machines can't be acceptable in terms of safety to patients with the current practice standards that we have. So I can't tell a patient, well, your chances of getting bladder cancer from, inhaling this stuff after you've been inhaling it for 3 years anyway, is something we should ignore. I've taken that just like the SERV-HF data, where none of us believed it was true. How could this possibly be true? This is the machine we need. But the data did not lie, and until something else replaced it, as responsible scientists, we had to take it. I approached this the same way with the VOCs. They're real. They're out there. They are carcinogenic, and if you blow this in your lungs long enough, well, let's put it this way: maybe I'd let my mother-in-law do it, but I certainly wouldn't let my mom do it. That's the mother-in-law test in science.
So you're right. You talked about SERV-HF, and recently, right, we had prelim results from the Advent-HF, which of course was stopped early because of the Philips recall. But the data seemed to show that the Philips ASV device wasn't harmful for patients with a reduced ejection fraction. So does that sort of make it then a medically necessary device?
You really shouldn't go very far with this, because ultimately that Advent HF data has not been peer reviewed. It's been kicked around, and I think it was way too publicly broadcasted. And that when peer review comes around and you look at the protocol, what patients it's really talking about, probably more predominantly OSA patients. Let's face it, an OSA patient, a patient with heart failure who had mostly treatment emergent central sleep apnea, was not part of the protocol. They can't define who's in that protocol. I don't think this frees up the ASV device for those patients, given the fact that, again, it's not peer reviewed and the protocol wasn't designed that way.
I would also echo what Peter said. I think that it's hard to draw conclusions from that study. And yes, they sort of threw in the towel when the recall happened, but that took a long time to enroll in that study. So, part of the other problem is that the treatment of heart failure has changed over the time that Advent HF was enrolling. And, I agree with Peter that it's a lot of obstructive patients. So I don't think it's that the ResMed versus Philips algorithm. I don't know that I would go so far as to say the Philips ASV is a medically necessary device. I think that still remains to be seen.
Well, and it sort of raises this issue, right? Because a lot of that trial was in Canada, and Philips can make PAP therapy devices, just not in the US, right? But they can make them for Europe and in Canada.
Well, they don't have the same regulatory issues
Mm-hmm.
in Europe and Canada as Canada's fairly similar to the US, but certainly in Europe, they are not bound to the same kind of issues as we are. And it may be interesting to see how that market emerges for exactly the reasons that you're saying, that they market it that way to say, look, it's safe and we don't
Mm-hmm.
have the FDA hanging over us.
Well, and so I kind of wonder about even like logistically, they have these manufacturing plants, right? And so do those get sold off? Are they going to make devices in the US and then ship them elsewhere? I mean, what do you think is going to happen with those plants?
I think these are all great questions. I think we're all waiting to see. I mean, one of the things I was going to mention a little bit earlier, but one of the things when we look at these end of service dates that are 5 years out and we talk about care orchestrator, part of it is this issue of trust. And I think that was broken a little bit with, the recall and everything. And so, we don't know. It's obviously up to Philips. But if they say we're going to do something, I think there is that little squeamishness on a lot of providers' minds that, they say they're going to do it, but can we trust them to do this or not? So I think we'll have to see.
Well, I think when we sit down with them, you poked the bear perfectly there. What are these plants going to be doing? And what are these so-called milestones that you will cross that may or may not change your U.S. behavior? And whether they share that with us or not, I don't know.
So care orchestrator you touched on, and this should be there at least 5 years, right? That's what they've told us?
Yeah.
That's what they've said, yeah.
I mean, I was kind of relieved to hear that.
Well, I don't know that you're going to sit and wait 5 years to see how this evolves. What we have learned is how volatile our whole practice is, that in the next 5 years, your question of what you're doing with that device may not be pertinent at all.
Mm-hmm. So one thing I think we all learned from this, and you're right, you kind of hinted at, well, we went through this with ServeHF, right? And you had 200 phone calls a day. For us, this seemed bigger. And so, we had, patients calling, and this was a conversation we had in clinic all the time. I bookmarked the recall website so I could help patients register their devices. And so this was everyday conversation. And so, I mean, I totally get patient advocacy, but it just seemed like a lot of this burden fell to clinicians.
Yeah.
And so do you think that we need change in FDA oversight?
Well, it was the FDA oversight that got us where we are. FDA doesn't provide a management plan. They only provide recognition of the problem. So de facto, there is no government agency out there to manage a problem once the watchdog, which is all they are, decrees this. They can only obstruct the process more, which is kind of what they've done, to the extent that Philips says, look, it's just prohibitive for us to deal with this. We're not going to make product anymore. That's our solution currently to the problem. That's the frightening part about this. All they can do is stop product management. They can't help you after that.
Well, and I mean, but yes and no, right? Because this has been going on for, a decade?
Yeah, it's been going on for a long time. I would just also throw in that part of the problem with the recall, it does show how fragmented our care is in this country of sleep apnea. And, so I write a prescription, it goes over to a durable medical equipment company. Who's sort of managing the patients, who owns their data, who is responsible for getting information to the patients, whether it's the manufacturer, the doc, or the DME. It would be great if we sort of learned something from this. I sort of agree with Peter that I don't know that we want the FDA to go to a different level of regulation. They could mandate registries or things that are more similar to pacemakers or other implantable devices. I don't know if we want to do that, but it would be nice to have a more clear pathway of how do you get information to patients. It would be great to even, when I write a prescription, it's not clear to me where that prescription is going to go. We have one person in our office, her whole job is to essentially liaison with DMEs. It's complicated. So.
Yeah, that is complicated. On a recent episode of the podcast, Lisa Wolf was chatting with us, and she was very, very clear that we can't allow ourselves to be dependent on one company moving forward. And you mentioned this earlier. Are there companies that will fill this void?
Well, there's no question from the standpoint of the bilevel devices that there are outside companies jumping in, trying not to be proprietary with this, but I'll just say that a very large vendor has already taken the Trilogies off the shelf in anticipation of the fact that they're not going to get the service. This is the majority of home ventilators in the country right now, and they've shifted to a foreign manufacturer with a toy that they're becoming familiar enough that they feel it's going to replace eventually all of their Trilogy devices well before they will no longer be serviced by Respironics.
So sort of preemptive strike.
Yes.
Have you had experience with sort of the, non-ResMed, non-Respironics devices?
Yeah, very simply from the standpoint of what Rotech has decided to do, we are now becoming very familiar with the Lowenstein Louisa device. And some of the other ventilators that provide alternative features, some that have multiple features. They have a specific code, the 466 code, that allow multiple features. I'm much more comfortable using that now in ALS patients. The ones that provide high flow nasal cannula therapy, which is not prescribable in the United States for coverage, is attached to some of these ventilators, where if you're clever and find an indication for a ventilator in those patients, for example, pre-transplant patients, then you can go down that avenue. We're learning to adapt to using the current coverage criteria to move into different kinds of equipment, some of which is foreign.
Aneesa, have you played around with these?
Some. We are actually just starting, but we're approaching it here a little differently. We are recognizing that likely the Trilogies are going to be harder to get and things are going to change. So the thought is, let's start thinking now about moving forward. And maybe this is an opportunity to better work together with the DME so that we're not in a situation where a DME is picking what they're going to sell and we have to use that. Whereas we say, well, you know what, this is what we want to use in our hospital. So we can start setting them up on the home mechanical ventilation systems and making sure that the medical equipment companies are stocking the same types of equipment. So we're trying to start by having some conversations sort of at all levels so that we're all on the same page of what our needs are and the education around that space. Does that make sense?
I'll make a shout out to what Aneesa is saying, what Bob has just said, that the relationship that we develop with the actual deliverable vendor is now becoming more crucial. And to say the social worker will do this, as certainly most of the residents in the hospital believe, they couldn't recite a single criteria for coverage for these things, and they rely on somebody else than the guy who's signing the prescription. And I would bet every vendor in the Ohio State Lab area and the UCSD area, one knows Bob Owens and another knows Aneesa Das, and I can tell you everybody in Rochester knows my name, that getting on the phone and making these things happen is how that actually works in a deliverable way, that you understand how they're fearing the audit and where these criteria, if you behave and you spread that word, which is sometimes you got to be a Philadelphia lawyer to understand, if they do that right, then the patient gets what they need. Otherwise, the patient goes in there and they say, your dumb doctor didn't do this, and they do not get treatment.
I was just going to say, at the end of the day, it's about improving relationships, right? These improved relationships and improved communication is what we're getting out of this. So that might be one potential silver lining to this.
Yeah, well, first off, I grew up in Philadelphia, so I'm still trying to understand what Peter was saying about Philadelphia lawyers. But I think that there's been a lot of growth in our field over the last few years, both in the number of patients, but I think in terms of what we're learning, things that we needed to do better. And I really like hearing the Ohio State's experience of okay, we're actually going to sit down with the DME and we're going to do this, together. I think that's great. We still have a number of different payers that we care for, and each payer has a different relationship with their DME. And then even though we're in San Diego County is quite large, and we have people coming from the mountains a couple hours away, and the DME that works for somebody in the city of San Diego doesn't work for somebody really far away. They've got their local mom and pop DME. And so I don't know. We have not really solved that problem yet very much. And then as I think you were also getting into, now people are coming back to clinic with, let's say, the Luna device, the 3B, equipment that I have not a lot of experience with. Mm-hmm. I ask patients, how do you like this machine compared to ResMed or, Philips or whatever you had before? And people are not always positive. I will say the user interface in terms of downloading information. I mean, I love AirView. I like Care Orchestrator in terms of being able to check on patients, change the prescription remotely. I mean, that is a huge advantage to the sort of Coke and Pepsi we have of CPAP manufacturers, and it's a lot harder with some of these newer companies.
That's funny. I refer to them as Coke and Pepsi too.
I haven't, but I plan to use it. Sure.
I would recommend it, and now we're down to Tab and RC Cola.
Yeah, I use RC Cola too. So I love this conversation advocating for collaborating with our vendors, right? And really arriving at those decisions, jointly. Is there a role to collaborate with industry for what do we want the next, bi-level PAP to have? Which features do we like from the Lowenstein, and is there room there, or is that a bridge too far?
Absolutely. If you work through direct relationships with manufacturers, you're quickly made aware of the concept of marketing and engineering. And the people who are engineering these devices are absolutely amazing and imaginative people who, when directed to do something, for example, the humidity department, there are huge advances going forth in humidity that we haven't even seen in the market yet. We haven't made perhaps enough emphasis on humidity to bring this forward. But those are the kind of things where these people are scientists. They're gifted people that are way beyond my pay grade to understand how to manipulate flows and manipulate humidity and broadcast this information, that the more that we sit down with those people without prejudice and exchange ideas, the more this whole process is going to work than bringing something that looks kind of cool to somebody. The marketing guys grab it, they put it out there, and then it gains a lot of market share. And then before we know how it even works, we're ordering it.
Mm-hmm.
That's a strange process.
Well, and I feel like there's a difference in sort of outlook, right? Like if you talk to the people in Silicon Valley, for example, with some of these wearables, they want they start with a minimally viable product versus we are kind of looking at it from what is effective for our patients, what fits with our workflow, what is something we can access. So, I think that collaboration is important, but I also feel like it needs to be, not just Coke and not just Pepsi, right? It just sort of needs to be with industry as a whole.
I totally agree with that. And I personally made an effort to pick up the phone, and I'm amazed how quickly they are eager to have a conversation.
So Aneesa, you touched on silver lining. Are there other silver linings to this recall?
Well, I hope that it's taught us to be more nimble, and maybe, you had mentioned before, what changes need to be made with FDA. maybe made us realize that we need to allow more nimble changes so that we can have opportunities to have therapies quickly for patients, right? So I think that the nimbleness of change, and let's be honest, COVID taught us that too. I think that will be something moving forward, figuring out how to quickly mobilize communication to people, figuring out, I think it's also helped our society of sleep medicine, right? Learn that we need to rely on each other. And I think there was these kinds of big problems, improved communication among colleagues. These kinds of conversations, right? I think are becoming more prevalent.
I actually really loved the collaborative approach with ATS and CHEST and ASM and AAN. And I loved that it didn't feel competitive to me. It felt very collaborative. Hey, have you thought about this? And do we think that PAP is aerosolizing? And what do you think we should do about this? And I loved that. So that for me was a silver lining to COVID, which I know is probably not.
I agree.
Yeah.
There's nothing like a common goal or enemy, however you want to say it, right? To bring people together.
We ultimately came together. I was part of the early gathering of the ACCP and the ATS and all of that, and there was nothing more collaborative in that early days of that, because we were patient focused. We had people in the office that we had to deal with that, for example, with this SERV-HF, you could completely realign your thoughts to what was happening in your office. The patient who wasn't using it anyway, the patient who said, I will do whatever you say, doc, and the one in the middle who just couldn't make a decision about what was going on. So all of those individual patients had to be addressed. And that's where we shared the best knowledge of how we just got to roam together.
So what do you guys think this will do to the, diagnostic and treatment pathway for obstructive sleep apnea? Is it going to change over the next 5 years?
I think it will change. I think that I think it will change because it has been changing.
Yes.
I think in my career, I think sleep medicine was very much lab based, and now it's going to be sort of more home based, and I think it will be increasingly more wearable based. And I actually think that's a great thing, and I think that we are more focused now, and this has happened because of SERV-HS and HF and SAVE and a lot of turmoil in the field. But I think now we're actually trying to make patients feel better. We're not just treating a number. We're sort of saying, what's your symptom, and here's how I'm going to work with you to make you feel better. And I think it's great. I love my sleep clinic, and I work in the ICU too, and I can't do all of it, but I mean, I love coming into my sleep clinic and people are like, yeah, I love my CPAP, or that wasn't for me, and now I'm using this device and I feel great. And so I think all of this has really helped us focus on, how do we make the patients feel better? And I think that's what we've been doing the last few years, and it's going to be more like that going forward.
Okay, so Bob just kicked the ball up in the air. This is a heretical thing to say, but here's a possibility. In fact, even the AHRQ 10 years ago asked the question a different way. Look, we're really trying to find out not whether you have OSA, how many stop breathing events you have. We're trying to find out if you respond to the treatment. Like what fool or crazy person would wear a CPAP if they got no benefit from it whatsoever? So if you as an experienced clinician said, do you or do you not have sleep apnea, changed it to, do you or do you not respond to the treatment I prescribe for your clinical disorder? So what's the harm in giving somebody CPAP directly who has a BMI of 35, who has witnessed apneas and hypertension, and an empiric APAP protocol? Bada boom, bada bing, come back, 100% compliant, feel better, and you've got the outcome that you want. So there's an example of just exactly redirecting this into, well, we got to get a sleep study because I think you got apnea so I can treat you. What do you mean? I already think I need to treat you. Why do I need to go through that additional diagnostic process. Now, I will say that as a whimsical, heretical thought, and not my purpose here to propose that is what we should do, because I still want my job.
Well, but some people like Dennis Wang, and he has talked about this forever, about why do we not treat this like asthma? Why do we not just do empiric treatment, and then if they get better, great, and if they don't, then you do the test.
Right. Why do you have to wait for PFTs for somebody who's wheezing in your office?
Right. And I think there's been some early trials in the VA, especially during COVID, where they couldn't do the testing, and then they just deployed empiric CPAP. So, I mean, that's interesting too.
The point being, there could be huge paradigm shifts in practice that I don't think any of us on this call really know where we're going to be in 5 years, because it is a wonderful, adaptable, evolving sport that we all enjoy, really patient focused. And where that discovery takes us is where we're going to go.
I do think you should get us on record as to whether or not Philips will ever come back to the U.S. market. We should put our nickels down.
You took the words right out of my mouth. So, crystal ball. What do you think? Is Philips going to come back to the U.S. sleep market?
Philips is a giant. They're $1 billion corporation, and this healthcare component, which has been a pimple on their side for several years now, can be eliminated, and they can just as quickly get back into this market. They could buy out another company and come in under a different rubric. And if the market is there, they will do it. If the market directs them to making submarines, they're going to make submarines. But I think they'll be back.
I think they will only be back under a different name. I don't think you're going to see Philips, respirators or ventilators or CPAPs.
I agree. They'll come in, they'll buy another company, and it'll be another name altogether.
Yeah,
Aneesa,
I agree. I think the name Philips has a lot of people, patients and consumers, wary. If they do it, I think they'll come in under another name as well.
So, final thoughts?
We live in interesting times.
That we do.
Yes. I mean, maybe a little too interesting. It'd be great if we didn't have to go through all this, but it's been fun. And I totally agree. I think it's been great to see ATS, CHEST, AASM. Great to talk with all of you today. I think that would not have happened without some of these challenges.
And at the end of the day, change is good. We never want to be stagnant, right? If we're not changing, we're not moving forward. So it's just sometimes the pushes that get us to move forward we don't like, but we're moving forward.
We never lose. We either get it right or we learn.
That's very wise words. It's a learning experience, right?
Correct.
Well, thank you all for joining us today and helping us to better understand how the Philips consent decree will impact the practice of sleep medicine.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks so much. This was great.
I had a wonderful experience talking to my friends, and I think the ideas that we share together hopefully will do something to advance the practice of medicine for our patients.
Thanks for listening to Talking Sleep, brought to you by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. For more podcast episodes, please visit our website at aasm.org. You can also subscribe through your favorite podcast service. And if you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave a rating or review. For more feedback or suggestions, email us at podcast@aasm.org. I hope you'll join us again for more Talking Sleep. Until next time, this is Seema Khosla, encouraging you to sleep well so you can live well.